Welcome to the Dungeon Painter online tutorial session for FGCon. We're using Dungeon Painter Online because it's a really easy tool to use. It's free, it's fast, it has a lot of good options. It's not the most complex tool, so it doesn't compete with things like Campaign Cartographer or even Dungenie. So there are a lot of other tools out there that can do a much better job than this. There is also another step in between Dungeon Painter Online and Campaign Cartographer, and that's Dungeon Painter Studio. I think it's a really awesome app. It takes all the ease and features of Dungeon Painter Online, but gives you a lot more options. There's a heap of things that you can do to actually manipulate objects. You can there's a lot more artwork included in it, and there's a lot of ongoing development for it. And because it's not a web-based app, there's a lot more things that they can do with that app. So I really recommend that if you want something that's really affordable and you want to make some good artwork for your RPG games and you don't want to spend a lot of money, jump onto Steam and look for Dungeon Painter Studio. It's by Pyromancer. It's a good way to say thank you, Tim, as well, for maintaining this Dungeon Painter Online website for all these years. One of the first things that we have to consider when we're making this map is who we're making the map for, what we're making the map for, and any requirements that may have. So we're designing a map for use with Fantasy Grounds. Now, most of you will know that Fantasy Grounds has some limitations about what sort of size images you can use without the risk of creating issues for yourselves or for your players later on, mostly due to memory issues. So the maximum file size I recommend for your maps is 2000 by 2000 pixels. But because we've got a landscape screen, most of us are using landscape screens. Our screens are pretty much twice as wide as they are tall. So we're going to stay within that range. And so we're going to look at a map of roughly 1500 by 1000 pixels. That's going to nicely fit within our limitations, but give us a big enough area for this encounter to take place in. We also want to think about our grid size. In Fantasy Grounds, the grid's default size is 5 feet. And most people either use 50 pixels per 5 feet or 100 pixels per 5 feet. So if you're using the bigger scale, 100 pixels, you can put a lot more detail into your maps, but working within your 2000 pixel maximum size, you're going to only be able to fit half as much map in. So I like the 50 pixels. I don't need quite as much detail in my maps, and I like being able to have a bit more map area inside those dimensions. So we're going to work with 50 pixels, 1500 wide, 1000 tall. So that's roughly going to be 30 squares in Dungeon Painter wide and 20 pixels tall. So I've chosen a grass for our base layer. Now I haven't chosen a nice green manicured grass because it's a roadside encounter out in the scrub somewhere. And you'll see that on the left hand side of the screen, the first maybe 8 squares or so, I've chosen another scrubby looking grass, just as a little bit of contrast. And in between those two, I'm going to draw our road. So firstly, I've unticked stick to grid, and I've changed the drawing tool to polygon, and I've drawn out our map, our road. So we've just roughly drawn some curves. Now, they're no beautiful curves. The tool is what it is. So we're just working with it as it is. After we've drawn out the road, I've then chosen the darkest texture I could find, and I'm drawing some sort of curves that follow the road on the top half of the road, and what they're meant to be suggestive of is perhaps the road cutting through a rise in the terrain. And there's no easy way to do this on a tile mapping system. So it's not like Photoshop where you can use some smudges and some darker gradients and put some shadow in there. So we're using what we've got available to us. So we follow the curves of the road, and we use again no stick to grid, and we're using the polygon shape, and we'll build out our what's supposed to represent sort of the road cutting. What you'll also see on the right hand side of the screen is I've created a number of groups, group 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't worry about the order of the groups, so just the fact that we've got a number of groups there. What we're going to do is we're going to put all of our base layer drawing items in the bottom group, and then we're going to put the next layer of objects, which is probably going to be the ruins, in the next group, and then we'll put things like the trees inside the next group. And what these groups will do is help us be able to navigate up and down the page when we want to help us navigate up and down the page when we need to put things back on the other layers. So what you'll see as we progress is that the number of layers will grow very, very quickly. Unlike with an application like Photoshop or Illustrator, where you might still have half a dozen or a dozen layers, but many of the changes that you make will be within one layer. In Dungeon Painter Online, every object that you place on the screen, every time you click and then release your mouse, it creates a new layer. So the number of layers builds up really quickly. So using these groups is really important to being able to keep your drawing organized. So another thing we need to think about when we're doing these maps is contrast. So you want to make sure that the important features of your map stand out from the other features around them. So you can see the ruins against the grass, you can see the road against the grass, you can see the trees against the ruins, whatever. So the grass colour tends to be a sort of medium beigey sort of colour that wants to blend with everything. So you really want to pick your tiles and your colour choices so that they stand out, and the detail is visible. You can see we can choose from from various different collections, and you'll find that you'll develop some favourites. You'll find a couple of walls that you really like, you'll find a couple of tiles that you really like, you'll find a couple of trees that you really like, and you'll use those most of the time. So what we're going to do now is place our first part of the tower on the map. You'll notice I've first selected a new group because we've got all our ground cover. Now the next layer up, building from the ground, is the ruins itself. Now to do the ruins, we're going to select a wall, and then we're going to set the line type or the wall type to arc. Now the arc is a little bit different in how you use it. You click once to start a line, and you drag your mouse, and then you click a second time to end the line. Now you can see I'm just dragging this line to cover 2 squares. Then when I move my mouse on the opposite axis, it starts to create an arc. And because we've chosen a small line, the arc is going to kind of grow around it to a circle shape. And it feels a little bit counterintuitive at first, but it's quite simple. It works. You notice that I've created an opening that's about 2 squares wide, but you can see that the shape of the walls kind of impinges on that a bit, so it's really only 1.5 squares wide. So that's really why we can't make the opening only 5 feet wide or 1 square wide, because it won't be that size by the time the wall angles are introduced. Now I'm positioning this tower far enough away from the top and the right edges of the map that I can have a little bit of terrain there, because I'm sure that some sneaky rogue or ranger or other character is going to want to sneak around the back and not go in the front door. So give them enough map that they can have room to work in. You can use the weather vane arrow icon to move the current layer around. You click on that and then select a layer. You select a layer and then you move it around and position it. There's also the next button along is used to rotate the current layer, and the next 2 buttons are to move that layer up and down. You need to do a lot of that if you don't use groups. You'll find yourself moving stuff up and down all the time. If you use your groups, you'll find that you will be able to position things in the right layers much easier. The ×2 button duplicates the current layer, and What I'm doing next is just drawing a few walls, and a lot of these tile mapping applications, they include shadows and ends on the walls. And so if you're just using line and you need to draw a square or a multiple lines to make up your shape, you'll find you get a far better effect if you use the poly line to create your shape. To start a polyline, you click to start drawing. Each time you click, it creates a corner, and to finish the shape off, you either click twice at the end or you join back to the start, and once your mouse clicks the starting spot, it will automatically finish that off. What we're going to do next is put a floor on the tower, and what we're going to do is select our floor shape or our floor tile, and then we're going to select ellipse. You can see I'm sort of positioning this above the tower, and that's because it's going to draw a circle shape. So I position it above the tower, and my tower is roughly 6 by 6 squares, so I'm going to drag it down 6 by 6 squares, and you'll see the right shape there. What you notice is that the floor is actually sitting on top of the walls, so I've got to drag it down below the walls. And we'll see that's a much more visually pleasing effect. And I'm going to do the same thing for the square part of the tower, but obviously I'm going to use the rectangle shape again this time. If you had different floor types between the two different towers, you'd want to position the square floor lower down underneath the round floor so that the shapes are retained. I'm going to go into the next group now, and because we're going to start adding features that are the next layer up as we build our way from the earth up towards the sky. So we always work with the biggest objects. We start with the grass, and then the road cutting, then we've drawn the towers and the floor. So the next biggest thing on our map is going to be trees. So we're going to place some trees on the map, and the same sort of guidance holds for the trees as well. You want to use trees that contrast with the background, that contrast with the tower, that contrast with each other. And you're only going to use 2, 3 or 4 types of trees for the most part. In nature, an acorn tree grows, and acorns grow on it, and they drop to the ground, and some of them will take hold and a new acorn tree will grow. So you'll get clumps of like trees next to each other. So do the same on your map. When you choose your type of tree, put 3 trees next to each other at least, maybe even more than 3 types, and you'll scatter them around a little bit as well, but you tend to have areas where you've got similar trees bunched together. And you can see I've chosen a nice dark green tree here. I'll choose sort of a nice bright green one next, and we'll start placing the trees all around. You'll see as well that I don't place my trees within my frame. My frame's 30 by 20, but a lot of my objects are sticking out over the frame. And when we finish this, we're going to export or trim this map to be exactly 30 by 20, and it'll kind of look a bit stupid. Not stupid, it looks more obviously contrived when all the objects sit neatly within the frame. So overlap some of them around the edge. You can see that some of the trees overlap the road, some of them overlap the road cutting, the same sort of thing. And a bit later on you'll see that some of the trees will overlap the tower. The other part with overlapping is that you want to put your smaller trees on the map first. We always build from the bottom up in terms of our big features first. So put the smaller trees down in clumps, put the medium trees down in clumps, put the bigger trees down in clumps, and make sure that every now and again you have a bigger tree overlapping a smaller tree, and that adds to that sense of height and that sense of depth or realness in your images. You can see that the trees are actually rotating a random number of degrees each time I click on one of them, and that creates a little bit more difference between the trees, even though there's only 3 different types of trees on the map. You can see that I'm using the stamp tool. The stamp tool places one object every time I click the mouse once, and it creates a new layer as well. If I change it to the brush tool, when I click and drag, it'll create a nice long paintbrush effect. It's good for creating hedges or certain types of other effects like water or sand or roads. Not so good for trees, or not for this particular type of image anyway. I'm going to speed the video up a little bit and get all the trees placed out in the map. In this next section, I'm going to start putting some rocks and some other types of detritus on the map. So you might notice I've switched back to the first group. So I'm working down near the road, and I'm just placing some rocks along the edges of the road, along the edges of the cutting. I'm going to put some under trees, and I put some up against the tower. And you'll see I switch between different groups as I put things into different places here. I really like these rubble shapes that I'm choosing in this next section. They're really good for showing the age of the building, of the ruins, showing the detritus left over from, or the rubble left over from the construction of the tower or from the road. And so I'll use these to quite liberally. I'll put them along the edges of all sorts of things. You might see some of these along the edge of the road. I'll put on top of the road. Some of them in this scene and a bit further down, I might put them between the grass and the road, and that way they overlap the grass, but they don't overlap the road, and it keeps the road being a little bit more defined, but it softens the edge between the two and adds a little bit more realism, I think, to the map, or makes the map more pleasing to the eye. You'll see some of these shapes are quite obvious. They're particularly longer in one direction, and with these rotating shapes you might find that you need to have one of these objects in a particular orientation. So what I do is just click off the map a couple of times until I get the object into the right orientation, and then I can place it on my map. I'm basically now doing exactly the same thing, but we're doing it around the tower itself. So I work on the sort of guiding principle that things like the tower is going to have, it's probably going to have been built on some sort of rocky outcrop. As the tower is aged and decayed, some stones are going to fall down from it. Maybe there's a little bit of material left over from the construction of the tower itself. So I put a lot of rocks and stuff around the base of the tower, and again just breaks up those edges, merges it into the background a little bit without removing a focus from the tower itself. Same goes for things like sand and leaves and wind. So all these lighter materials are going to accumulate up against edges. So the tower itself, if it's not currently full-time occupied, or no one's living in it, then sand and dirt is going to blow into it, leaves are going to blow into it. So all along the walls, inside and out, you're going to find some sort of build-up of material. Also drop a few clumps of stones or other objects out around the general area of the map, and this is again where your layers really matter. Making sure that your stones are not on top of your trees. So make sure you find your right layer, find the right spot in your layer, and start dropping things. And oftentimes when you have objects that are partially or mostly obscured by the bigger object above, again it has quite a pleasing effect, and you can add these how you feel. Go a little bit crazy if you like. You can always hit the delete button on these. You might want to add some other things in here, maybe something else to draw the party off the map and off the road in the first place. Maybe they can't actually see this tower from the roadside, but maybe there's a wisp of smoke coming from within a tower, or maybe you spy a campsite that's just a little bit off the road, or a trail leading to the campsite. So I might put in here a campsite with a fire pit that maybe travellers use occasionally, and it's just enough to tempt your party to come off the map. You might put a tent hidden under the trees somewhere that maybe even whatever nasty denizens are currently occupying the tower that the party is about to encounter, but maybe this you might secret a tent under the trees, and maybe there's a local druid or a local ranger who's pretty much made this area his base, but has made himself a little bit scarce with the incursion of the current nasties, and he might, or she might, have some sort of impact in the little encounter. Maybe has just been caught by the orcs, or maybe he'll come in and join in if the party find themselves overwhelmed by the odds, and they might make a new ally, long term or short term, who knows. You can see with a fire pit, put some sand underneath the fire pit, drop a few rocks around it, and just have a little bit of fun with what you're doing here out on the map. What I'm doing now is adding some age to this tower by using this rubble, putting say 3 piles of rubble right next to each other on top of the wall, and that really gives the effect that the wall has crumbled either fully or partially here, and that really will help with the encounter itself. So there may be a hobgoblin guard lounging here, maybe he's skied away from his fellow bandits or marauders, and he's smoking some happy tobacco up here on the rocks, and maybe your rogue or your ranger, as he snuck around here, he's spied them. Maybe he's climbed into the trees a little bit, and you can see past him and see the rest of the marauders inside the tower. So it gives the party another tactical option. So the main entrance to this tower is kind of hidden here by the trees at the bottom, but now we've got another potential sally point into this fortification. Of course, your party are probably going to ignore you completely, and the 2 entry points you've got, and someone will fly over the wall, or someone will scale the wall, or climb a tree and jump in, or create a disturbance and lure them out. The party are always manage to disrupt whatever I think they will do. Again, with the whole layering thing, I like to put trees overlapping the wall in some areas. Again, it creates a bit more of a pleasing look, but it also shows that the trees have got height. It also shows Mother Nature's unstoppable march, reclaiming all the things that man foolishly think will last forever. And again, it gives more role-playing opportunities for your party, more tactical options for them, climbing trees to get in, or using the trees as cover, or using it as an egress point if things turn sour quickly. You might even put a tree inside the structure. There's some detritus landed in here, seeds landed in here, a tree started to grow, the tree's roots continue to break down the walls, so putting that tree near where the walls have crumbled a little bit. Maybe the tree's got some special significance. Maybe there's the druid in the party, or some NPC that's travelling with a party recognises this tree, or it's a specific type of tree. So the tree that you place inside the encounter object, it might be different to the tree that you use everywhere else. Maybe it's a living tree, maybe it's a dead tree. Just again, if you're doing stuff like this, make sure that the tree that you use has a decent amount of contrast against the rest of the map. You can probably see here that maybe I should have used more than 4 groups. The 4 groups has helped massively in keeping me on the right track and being able to find what layers I wanted to be on, but maybe 4 more layers, maybe even splitting these current layers up into a couple more layers, would have been really effective. Again, you're going to build up a few objects and trees and tiles and things like that you find are favourites. This is another one of mine, is this stones. It's just a really light scattering of stones, but again, if you drop this on large areas or block areas where you've got a fairly consistent texture over a large area, it just really breaks up the line of the way your eye runs over it, and they're not bold or heavy like a lot of the other objects, you can just scatter a couple of these in various places, and again, I think they just add that little bit of extra to your image. When you're putting rubble or sand or leaves or similar things up against a wall, you imagine the stuff is not going to be the same on both sides of the wall. So the way we get it to go up against the wall is to put it under the wall, and that way the wall creates a hard line. But you need to make sure that the object that you're placing up there doesn't stick through to the other side of the wall, so that you get the same piece of rubble on both sides of the wall. So push it underneath the wall, but only to the point where the wall covers it over. Our map's basically done now, or it's done as far as I'm concerned for today's session. So what we're going to do now is export this map, and we use the export to JPG PNG option. Now this is going to export it only to a PNG file, and ultimately we don't want it to be in PNG file because it's too heavy in terms of its memory footprint. But we'll export this. You'll notice when I choose my export options, I drag the corners down to the edges of my 30 by 20 map, and that way all these bits that are hanging off the edge are cleaned up. Because I'm doing this, I don't apply the grid to it. I don't apply the coordinates to the map, and I change the scale to 50 pixels, so I want 50 pixels per square or 50 pixels per 5 foot square, which is the scale that we agreed upon at the start of this video. You can also choose the save option, and it will save your map as an RDM, and that RDM file can be re-imported later on. Say you've got a map you're really happy with, or it's not quite finished, you want to save it, download it, you can re-upload it later on, and you can share it with somebody else if it's something you really like or they've really liked, and that way you can shortcut the development of your next map. So look, I don't try to build the most perfect looking maps. I don't try and put furniture and things like that in my maps. I try and make my maps quickly. I don't like to spend too long on maps. I don't have enough time to spend a long time on maps, and so if I can build a map in 5 to 10 minutes, I'm really happy, and I'll live with it. I find that players love maps, but they don't really get bogged down in the detail too much. They're here for the story, they're here for the combat, the adventure, and the maps just colour. What they're seeing in their mind and their imagination is far better than anything I can draw. So what we're going to have a look at next, though, is the size of these images. This image, when I exported it as a PNG file, is 4 megabytes roughly. I'm going to drag this image into GIMP. I love using GIMP. GIMP's very much like Photoshop. It's an open source version. It's a bit different, but it's the one I'm used to. So I'm going to drag it straight into GIMP, and I'm going to export it as a 90% JPG file just to compare the file sizes, and we'll see that the JPG is roughly 1 meg, so a quarter of the size of the original PNG file. But I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to export it at 70% quality. So the original JPEG was 90% quality. I'm going to export it at 70% quality, and then I'm going to do something that might feel strange. I'm going to export it at 40% quality, and we'll get all these files out, and we'll compare the sizes of them all. And you'll see that the PNG was 4 meg, the 90% JPEG was 1 meg, the 70% was half a meg, and the 40% was way down at 1/3 of a meg, so less than 10% of the size of the PNG file. Okay, so maybe the images won't look as good. Let's have a look. If we open up these images in Photo Gallery, and then we scroll through them, PNG, then JPG, then JPG 70, and then JPG 40, we'll see very little difference. This will change depending on the image that you're using. Some images will have, you'll see a lot more variation in the quality when you drop the JPEG quality right down. But in this particular image, I can't see the difference. Absolutely there are differences, but to a casual inspection there is zero difference, other than the fact that my file weighs less than 10% of the size of the original file. Thank you for joining in this session today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some value out of it. And please consider buying Dungeon Painter Studio from Steam and supporting Pyromancer. You get all the features of Dungeon Painter Online, but you get a whole bunch of new tiles and a whole lot of new features, and of course it's continuing to be developed. Have fun, enjoy your games. Thank you.